The beginning of the world. Actually, Buddhism is never interested in the discussion on the beginning of the universe loka, since it is regarded as merely a metaphysical speculation which does not have any pragmatic value to overcome problems faced by people. That is why in one of the discourses, the Buddha also says that the first beginning of the universe is not observable. However, as stated above, like other religious texts belonging to other religions, some Buddhist texts also contain myth and legendary elements. These myths or the legends sometimes were taken from the local or indigenous beliefs that were prevalent in India during the time of the Buddha. Those myths or the legends were used by the Buddha or his disciples to convey certain religious teaching. They are sometimes used to convey moral teaching advocated by the Buddha, and sometimes are used to reject certain teaching or religious beliefs belonging to other religions. The concept of Mara, whose literally means death or the killer, is one of the examples of Buddhist mythology which is sometimes used to convey the idea of the tempter, the devil or the evil one. It symbolizes all that is connected to with the realm of rebirth and opposed to liberation from suffering. Commenting on this, Teo Linghi says thus: "It is remarkable fact, and one which is fully evident from a survey of the mythological element found in the Buddhist scriptures, that early Buddhism not only tolerated indigenous beliefs of the kind which have been described, but, as will appear in the next chapter, it went farther than this. From the materials which were readily available, so to speak, it produced its own characteristically and peculiarly Buddhist mythology of evil." There are still many myths or legends which are scattered in the Buddhist texts, but probably the most famous Buddhist myth in Buddhist scholarship which was used by the Buddha to reject certain religious teaching belonging to other religion is what is stated in the Agana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. Actually, the main purpose of this discourse actually is to reject the notion of caste system which was advocated by Brahmanism rigidly. However, when we read carefully, the text can be used as a philosophical basis for the establishment of ecological conservation. Here the Buddha spoke about the evolutionary process of the origin of society, which was usually misinterpreted by some scholar as the text which is discussed about the origin of the world according to Buddhism. The text depicts how the behavior or moral condition of the human being really has impacts towards their environmental condition. Moreover, here we will see that there are no involvement of the concept of God in the beginning of this earth according to Buddhism. In this text, there is a description about the Buddha who had discussion with two of his disciples named Bharadvaja and Vasetha. It is said that they were ridiculed by their former Brahmanic friends for being converted to be the disciples of the Buddha. Their former friends said that both of them have fallen to the lower caste because of by becoming the disciples of the Buddha. To console both of them, finally the Buddha preached the sermon by using myth or legendary elements about the origin of the so-called caste. Here is some extracts of the discourse. As follows. There comes a time, Vasetha, when, sooner or later after a long period, this world contracts. At the time of contraction, beings mostly born in the Abhasara Brahma world. And there they dwell, mind-made, feeding on delight, self-luminous, moving through the air, glorious, and they stay like that for a very long time. But sooner or later, after a very long period, this world begins to expand again. At a time of expansion, the beings from the Abhasara Brahma world, having passed away from there, are mostly reborn in this world. Here they dwell, mind-made, feeding on delight, self-luminous, moving through the air, glorious, they stay like that for a very long time. At that period, Vasetha, there was just mass of water, and all was darkness, blinding darkness. Neither moon nor sun appeared, no constellation or stars appeared, night and day were not distinguished, nor months and fortnight, nor years no seasons, and no male and female, beings being reckoned just beings. And sooner or later, after a very long period of time, savory earth spread itself over the waters where those beings were. It looked just like the skin that forms itself over the hot milk as it cools. It was endowed with color, smell and taste. It was the color of fine ghee or butter, and it was very sweet, like pure wild honey. Then, Some being of greedy nature said, "I say, what can this be?" and tasted the savory earth on its finger. In so doing, it became taken with the flavor, and craving arose in it. The other beings, taking their cue from that one, also tasted the stuff with their fingers. They too were taken with the flavor, and craving arose in them. So they set to with their hands, breaking off pieces of the stuff in order to eat it. And the result of this was that their self-luminance disappeared. And as a result of the disappearance of their self-luminance, the moon and the sun appeared, night and day were distinguished, months and fortnight appeared, the year and its seasons. To that extent the world revolved. From the above-mentioned text, we can say that the above-mentioned description used by the Buddha contains mythological elements. We can see that the chronology of the beginning of the world, food etc. as depicted in the text is far from historical fact and truth. There is a myth or legendary element in it. We can say so, after referring the characteristics of myth as presented by Iliad in his book Myth and Reality. According to him, there are 5 characteristics in a myth. He says thus: myth, as experienced by archaic societies, constitutes the history of the acts of the supernaturals. That this history is considered to be absolutely true and sacred. That myth is always related to creation. It tells how something came into existence, or how a pattern of behavior, an institution, a manner of working were established. This is why myths constitute the paradigms for all significant human acts. That by knowing the myth one knows the origin of things and hence can control and manipulate at will. This is not an external, abstract knowledge but a knowledge that one experiences ritually, either by ceremonially recounting the myth or performing the ritual for which it is the justification. That in one way or another one lives the myth, in the sense that one is seized by the sacred, exalting power of the events recollected or reenacted. So, when we analyze the description of the above-mentioned text, we can see that in the description there are some of the characteristics of myth as stated by Iliad. First of all, the above-mentioned text describes about the history of the acts of the supernaturals. Although it may be somewhat different from the concept of those of theistic religions like Islam and Christianity. The text however mentions the involvement of the history or story of some divine beings which in the Buddhist context as stated above is Abhasara Brahma world. Those divine beings obviously are not human beings, but supernatural beings. Secondly, the history of the beginning of this world as described in the text usually is considered as absolutely true by almost all Buddhist people, because in reality they can see that there is this world where they live in. However, it may be only very few who regarded the history or story as a sacred thing, since the concept of sacred is hardly known in the Buddhist teaching. Thirdly, the description in above-mentioned text is also related to creation and tells how something came into existence, or how a pattern of behavior, an institution, a manner of working were established. The texts obviously describe how the world and everything in it were established or were started. Of course the 4th and 5th characteristic as stated by Iliad may not be found here, but at least we have found 3 characteristics after analyzing the text. Therefore we can say that there are mythology elements in the Agana Sutta. Another important point, the concept found in the text about the beginning or origin of the world is really different from the view stated by historians, scientists, and archaeologists. The story mentioned in the text cannot be verified scientifically, since it is only mythological or legendary account. The text also never mentions how animal kingdom was started. However, we can take a moral lesson from what the text has described. From the text, we can see that greed tendency among those beings is really the main cause of the problem environmental change. Due to their greed, those beings finally had to accept their consequences, namely lost their self-luminosity and the appearance of moon, sun etc. Though such a discourse may be far from what so-called historical facts, but we can see the moral value from what the text wants to convey. In the modern time, greed, arrogance and other psychological tendencies among human beings which are really the main cause of environmental problem. Such idea can be seen from the continuity of the text, which states thus, "And those being continued for a very long time feasting on this savory earth, feeding on it and being nourished by it. And as they did so, their bodies became coarser, and a difference in looks developed among them. Some beings became good-looking, others ugly. And the good-looking ones despised the others, saying, 'We are better looking than they are.' And because they became arrogant and conceited about their looks, the savory earth disappeared. At this they came together and lamented." Here once again we can make a statement that our unwholesome psychological tendencies can give unwholesome impact towards our natural surrounding. It may not give the impact directly, but sooner or later our natural surrounding will get the effect due to our greed, arrogance, etc. Thus, as far as human beings do not control their unwholesome tendencies, environmental problem cannot really be solved properly. Therefore we can refer from the same text which illustrates further. The text then mentions that after the savory earth had disappeared, a fungus, in the manner of a mushroom, appeared. So the beings then started to feed on this new form of food. As a result, their bodies became coarser and the difference of their looks increased more. As in the earlier stage, the good-looking ones despised the others, and thus arrogance became more existed among them. Furthermore, it is said that due to their arrogance and conceited, the fungus disappeared, which then gave rise to the appearance of creepers which were shooting up like bamboo. Finally, those beings were said to feed on those new forms of food, the creepers. As the same aforementioned, after feeding on those creepers, their bodies became coarser and the difference in their look increased still more. They also became more arrogant. Due to they became more arrogant, the creepers then disappeared. Of course those beings lamented for what had happened, but their lamentation did not change the situation at all. However, then it is said that after the creepers had disappeared, rice which was free from powder and husks, fragrant and clean grained, appeared in open spaces. As we can guess, those beings then depended and fed on the rice which appeared in open spaces. It is said that when they took the rice for supper in the evening, the rice had grown in next morning, and when they took the rice for breakfast in the morning, the rice had grown and was ripe in the evening. Those beings feed on the rice for a very long period of time. The text then mentions that after they fed on the rice, not only their bodies became coarse and the difference in their looks became even greater, but also the difference of their sexual organ became appeared. After that, the women became excessively preoccupied with men, the men with women. As a result, their bodies were burned with lust, which then led them to commit sexual activities. In this stage, beings who committed sexual activities were regarded as a very bad thing, and therefore they started to build dwelling to hide their sexual indulgence. It is also said that laziness then were prevalent among them. Due to this laziness tendency, this really gives serious impact towards environmental condition, since it led those beings started to hoard the rice for their meal. The text mentions as follows, "Now it occurred to one of those beings who was inclined to laziness, 'Well now, why should I be bothered to gather rice in the evening for supper and in the morning for breakfast? Why shouldn't I gather it all at once for both meals?' And he did so. Then another one came to him and said, 'Come on, let's go rice gathering.' 'No need, my friend, I've gathered enough for both meals.' Then the other, following his example, gathered enough rice for 2 days at a time, saying, 'That should be about enough.' Then another being came and said to that second one, 'Come on, let's go rice gathering.' However, when those beings made a store of rice and live on that, husk powder and husk began to envelop the grain, and where it was reaped it did not grow again, and the cut place showed, and the rice grew in separate clusters. The above-mentioned story may not be historically true, but there is a hidden message behind the story for our humanity in this modern era. Based on the above-mentioned narration, we can also see the emphasis on the notion of dependent origination or interconnectedness, which is highly emphasized very much in Buddhism. According to Buddhism, everything occurs due to conditions or various factors. From what has been stated above, We can see the evolutionary process advocated by Buddhism as the consequence of the working of the law of dependent origination or interconnectedness. For instance, the discourse states that the disappearance of former food and the occurrence of new food is due to interconnected factors. Especially, human beings in certain cases are responsible for the changing process of what happened in nature. It is in such a concept that Buddhism always gives explanation about the occurrence of everything. In that way, Buddhism will never advocate the idea of a first cause nor the view of a single factor. That is why, the concept of dependence origination or interconnectedness paticca samuppada becomes the central teaching in Buddhism.